Welcome to the Conflict Stories podcast with Sam and Scott, where real people share their professional and personal stories of conflict.
Whether you're looking for advice or the comfort of knowing you're not alone, Conflict Stories brings the human and positive side of conflict to the forefront.
Tune in, connect, learn, and transform. Welcome to the Conflict Stories podcast with me, Sam, and Scott, and our guest today, Kieran Plasto, who we will introduce in a moment. I'm coming to you from the Adelaide Hills, which is Paramount country. And Scott, where are you joining us from today?
I'm in Byron Bay on Bundjalung country.
And Kieran, how about you?
Yeah, I'm in Brisbane. It's the traditional land of the Yagara and the Turrbal people.
Thanks, Kieran. It's really great to have you with us today. I've known Kieran for a couple of years now. He's got a super interesting background as a clinical psychologist, working in the police force as a police negotiator and then a counter-terrorism negotiator, and then in human resources in mining and resources industry in big international organisations, including work in the Congo, which I think might have been challenging just in itself. I remember having some conversations with you about often being stopped at the airport by people with submachine guns, which is an interesting way to deal with your daily commute. We're really looking forward to getting to know you and hearing some of your stories today, Kieran. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I hope I do have something interesting and useful to say.
I'm sure you will.
We often start with the question, how would you describe your relationship with conflict, Kieran?
Getting better, Scott. Getting better. I guess, for me, the more you have to do with it, hopefully, the better you get at recognizing it, managing it, embracing it, accepting it, running towards it as opposed to running away from it. I do often joke, I think the word conflict needs a better PR manager, right? That word conjures up a lot of negativity associated with it, which then, provokes anxiety and fear and avoidance. Conflict managed properly is actually great. It's actually sometimes provides us a pathway forward. It promotes different ideas. So I'm definitely embracing it more than probably I would have once.
Yes, and I guess that once I'm interested in terms of your family upbringing and how conflict was dealt with in your family. Do you want to give us a little bit of a snapshot of that?
I certainly wouldn't describe my family as a high conflict sort of family. I certainly never grew up with, that I can recall, overt arguments between my parents or anything like that. Having said that, had three brothers and a sister. So as with most boys, conflict tend to be ultimately resolved physically, which led to a short and not illustrious career in amateur boxing. So conflict ultimately would end up physical in our family.
And you did psychology at university?
Yeah, I wasn't good enough or didn't get the academic marks to become a lawyer or a journalist, and my report cards are often still the subject of mirth between some of my family. Consistent themes around another disappointing year for Kieran, didn't achieve his full potential, content to be the class clown, a distraction to both himself and those around him. So common themes, which ultimately I paid for in becoming an accidental psychologist, right? I went to university and studied a double major in psychology and also a major in English literature. I was always passionate about writing and reading and had a great role model. My mum left school back in the day in grade 10, went and worked at the bank in North Queensland. And she was a great role model. And after she had the children, she actually went back to night school and then enrolled in a Bachelor of Arts at what was then the DDIAE. So we were always surrounded by books, right? And then I did an honours degree in psychology and been registered as a psychologist for about 35 years, I think, at the moment, maybe 37 years since 1988.
How did you get into the police force? Tell us about that.
I worked as a psych, got my registration. You had to do a couple of years supervision. I bummed around Australia with a mate then for a couple of years and I ended up back in Western Queensland. I was married. We were working on cattle properties and I was working part-time as a psychologist. I had one daughter and then twin daughters very quickly. So we had 3 girls under the age of 2. Things were pretty tough financially, so I decided to join the police. I wanted to be a detective. I was playing rugby union in Roma and we had detectives, we had uniformed police, we even had some prisoners from Yulbar Correctional Facility playing in the team. I decided to become a detective. So went to the academy and then moved to Rockhampton and did a very short stint in uniform and then joined the criminal investigation branch.
So I assume you would have dealt with a few challenging conflict situations as a detective?
Very much so, very much so.
Kieran, I wonder if you could share with us a story of a conflict that you were involved in that had a really positive outcome and tell us a little bit about how that came about.
I have one in relation to a crisis intervention, Sam, that I did. I was in Townsville. I was a detective sergeant in Townsville. I arrested and charged a young female offender with a very serious offence, grievous bodily harm. And I'd sort of known of this person around the welfare social services circles. So I was in child protection and sex offenders unit. And anyway, knew that she was struggling with mental health issues and substance abuse issues, but nonetheless. And she was floating around many short-term stay homes. And with her behaviour, she would end up assaulting people or trashing the place. So the uniformed police would be called together. And by this stage, they were sort of in this revolving door, getting this person taken to the secure mental health facility in Townsville. But she would quite often be lucid enough to say, is Detective Plasto working today? And they'd say, yeah, I think so. And they'd ring me up and I'd say, yeah, stop by the station on the way and bring her in and say, what's going on with you? Hey, you can't keep doing this. We have a bit of a chat, cup of tea with a few sugars in it for her. Then I'll take her to the secure facility. And I said, look, I'm working. This was Saturday afternoon. I said, I'm working Tuesday, 2 to 10. If you're still in there, I'll come and visit, because I thought, just this poor kid's got no one. Anyway, so I was working 2 to 10, just on dusk. I'll never forget this. It was just on dusk. It was August, so it was a bit cool. I was actually on the way. I was working on my own, and the radio room called me up on the phone and said, we've got a situation. A person has climbed a crane and they're threatening to commit suicide. Can you go? You're the only negotiator working tonight. I said, yeah, fine, no problem. Headed out there, got there, spoke to some people, realised it was this young lady. She'd gotten away from the facility. She climbed a very tall crane and she was standing there on a less than a metre square plate and rocking in the nighttime breeze. So I climbed up as far as I could, and given I'm afraid of heights, that wasn't very far. And I was yelling out to the, I'm not coming up any further. She's going to have to come down and we're going to have a conversation. And anyway, I was convinced I was going to watch this person fall to their death. Resolved that situation. When I got her down, I said, look, you're stressing me. I said, I'm in the Juvenile Aid Bureau. I have to sort of see out, watch over you till you're 18, 17, I said 18. And after that, if there's detectives involved, they'll be from the criminal investigation branch. So I said, I'll tell you what, you keep yourself alive long enough, and I know your date of birth, and I'll make sure, for as long as I'm in Townsville, I'll work that day shift. You come into the station, I'll buy you a milkshake chocolate cake every year on your birthday. She said, will you? I said, 100%. So she said, okay. And we did that for the next 3 or 4 years. Anyway, I left the police, left Townsville, found out that just after that time, she got into some poor relationships. She had substance abuse issues. She had a number of children that were removed from her care, the whole cycle. Anyway, I got a call one day, a few years after I left the police, from a uniformed officer in Townsville and said, oh, you remember so-and-so? And I said, oh, yeah. And he said, I ran into her. She said that you saved her life. She's married. She's got her children back. She's working and everything's great. And you saved her life. And I thought, cool. That was pretty cool.
That's awesome.
I just always had the belief that no matter especially as a detective, no matter the crime, no matter the scenario, no matter the situation, I was going to treat people decently. So I guess I'd always develop a relationship with people.
And I know, Kieran, we've had quite a few conversations where you've talked about dignity as being an important theme in your work. I wonder if you'd like to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so especially when I became a police negotiator, and I was probably less than a year into my full-time assignment in the criminal investigation branch, and I had a big detective senior sergeant, and they advertised a police negotiators course. And he said, you should do the negotiators course. I said, I don't want to be, and I didn't know what they did. I just said, I don't want to be a negotiator. I want to be a detective. I want to focus on this. He was a big man. He said, I'm telling you now, you're doing the negotiators course. So I said, okay. And so subsequently became a police negotiator. And a lot of police negotiation work is actually crisis intervention, suicide intervention, people in a critical state of crisis. And I guess over that period of doing that for 10 years probably just reinforced my belief around treating people with dignity and compassion. I talk to my children and especially my grandchildren. We have two granddaughters that live with us, and Darcy and Daly, and they're sort of 8 and 9. And Daly was and still is very much into dinosaurs, Transformers, superheroes. And we were having a conversation about which superhero would beat each other in a fight, if Spider-Man fought Batman or whatever. So we were having that in-depth conversation at 5 a.m. in the morning. And I said to her, I have a superpower. And she said, you do, not Bear. They call me Bear. All my kids and grandchildren call me Bear. You do, not Bear. And I said, yes, I do. And she said, what is it? And I said, it's kindness. I said, you can change people's lives with kindness. And she thought for a minute, she said, that's cool, but I don't think it's a superpower. I do believe in the power of kindness as well. And Sam, you and I have definitely had conversations around, models and frameworks are great, right? But essential, macro qualities around forgiveness. We don't talk about forgiveness enough in the corporate world in relation to conflict, I don't think. I think we don't like to talk about care and care for each other that enables us to have difficult conversations or enables us to have conflict and resolve it because we care enough about each other or we care enough about the relationship. I think people perceive kindness as weakness, and I believe it's the opposite, So I went on to not only be I suppose a well-regarded negotiator, I also went on to then teach other negotiators and be an instructor. And one of the things we would try and instill in new negotiators is what we used to call a hook. And you had to try and find a hook to connect with a person in crisis or in a siege situation or someone with a weapon or someone a hostage or whatever it is. And that was around picking up on cues. So maybe somebody was wearing a football jersey, a rugby league jersey. Oh, do you follow the rugby league? What team do you support? Anything. And really I come to understand that a hook is really just to find that connection, that humanity, to create a sense of we will get through this, we will resolve this. Sorry if I'm on a soapbox, but as a psychologist, I guess, and as a conflict practitioner, it saddens me the rise of signs and videos about showing respect in the workplace, don't abuse the staff. When do we have to be told to be decent humans? And the rise of social media and all that sort of stuff that enables that. I think some of that stuff's taking us to a place as a humanity that we don't really want to go.
I really like what you said, Kieran, about the hook being a basis of connection so that you connect with them on a human level despite whatever is going on and the challenge that you face. And I imagine in those very high pressure situations that's important, but it's equally important when you're dealing with someone in a mediation context or a workplace conflict. I know that you've done a lot of work in different countries and different cultures, like most recently, I think, in the Congo. What things did you discover about working in a country that's very different from where you grew up?
Yeah. A couple of things, Sam, I guess. To me, always acknowledge that I was a guest in that country. it was a privilege to be there, and I was there to offer a skill set or an activity, but I never took that for granted. The other thing is to really understand around the history of a place. So the Congo, especially, talking colonisation. Recently, even in the town I was in, as recent as 1976, there was an uprising and a massacre. So how does that shape, you know, what perceptions are of me? But the other thing in terms of a hook too is, as to create that connection, what's really important to these people? In many cases, it was faith and family. And I was able to, especially when I was running group workshops, play on the fact. And also, I really tried to learn Swahili, which is the native language. So I could have limited conversations in Swahili. But the Congolese thought the fact that I, this 6'4", big 120 kilo bear covered in tattoos decided to try and learn basic Swahili was an act of humility, I guess. But the other thing that was an epiphany for me, Sam, and I suppose this goes to the connection with people. So I was working for a client for a mining operation, and they had a lot of problems, is their word, but there was big issues with what they would call illegal miners. Okay, these are locals that come onto the mine site day or night, pick up bits of copper and cobalt, and sort of cart them away on bikes with no tyres or seats or anything, and sell them for very small amounts. And I had an epiphany one day going to work this day and seeing an illegal miner carting, would have been a couple of 100 kilos on a push bike. And I thought, here I am, so out of my normal habitat, but this person and I, in many ways, we're no different. We're just trying to provide for our families, and he's doing what he can with what he has, and I'm doing what I can with what I have. That was, I suppose, a big epiphany for me in the Congo.
What about situations where you're managing workplace conflict with people with very different cultural backgrounds and maybe work expectations? What sort of challenges did you see in that context?
Well, it was interesting because some of the deep ingrained, especially over there, some of the deep ingrained cultural beliefs are around hierarchy, okay, and around familial status and age. So some of the conflicts were around, an example, if somebody had an issue with their supervisor, say in a plant or something, culturally they wouldn't challenge that because that person was higher up the organisation, okay? And so sometimes you're observing dynamics which in your upbringing, value system, beliefs don't appear great. Culturally, it's such a shift to try and negotiate this. I guess whether it's a resolution or not, just trying to get people to listen. Trying to get people to listen to understand, not be understood. Listen to try and problem solve something. I think we're really losing the art of listening. And I run a lot of workshops for organisations with blue collar employees. And you'll say to some of the longer term employees that have been around 30, 40, 45 years, what used to happen in meal rooms or crib rooms? Oh, we'd play cards. We'd talk to each other. What happens now? Oh, everyone's just on their phone, scrolling through their phone. So for me, the biggest thing, probably the foundation from any of the work I do, is, are people really listening? And that was, again, I suppose, something that I developed or learned as a negotiator. Listening involves being present, right? So because as a negotiator, high stress, high tension, if you're not on your game and you say the wrong thing, things can go south pretty quickly. So you really had to block out every other distraction and focus on the now. Secondly is the difference I talk between listening and hearing. People could listen, but are they really hearing what's being said? So I think for many, especially over there, if we could get people just to listen, then we were halfway towards trying to get a resolution.
So just on that, Kieran, I guess one of the questions we have is around what's the most challenging thing for you in all your different roles and working in different cultural environments? What is the biggest obstacle, the biggest challenge to moving forward? Do you see any other components that sort of block that progress?
Scott, I suppose as a psychologist, all those biases that we view the world through, that
Mm.
anchoring bias and all the other ones that root us to a position that we fundamentally are resistant to change to. And I think even from a neuroscience perspective, that brain that's hardwired to detect threat and doesn't like change, and then you put in ego as well, and requiring to perhaps say, oh, maybe I wasn't right in this situation. Agendas, hidden agendas, posturing and image management, I guess, barriers to all genuine humility, curiosity, forgiveness, desire to make things better, improve things, or find a way forward. I think we are our own worst enemy in many conflict situations, you know.
You've listed about 10 there, which I'll agree with. And I think the identity one is a really interesting one. How we see ourselves and how others may perceive us can be a real barrier and very challenging to work through. What about for you personally? What do you get triggered by in a
Yeah.
conflict? And what's the thing that sort of you find most difficult about conflict situation when you're managing others?
I think for me, as a mediator or as I guess, a facilitator that guides conversations, one is I really myself try and focus on taking accountability for the process, not the outcome, and try and be really clear about the success of this process, whatever it is, will be determined not in a few hours, but in the future. And that's on you, people, the participants. The thing I guess that triggers me that I get triggered by a lot of things, but I really try to do, I'd like to think mask well, is those things around disrespect and that fundamental not treating people well. And how does that transpire? Talking over the top of people, eye rolling, arm folding, all those behavioral and language cues that treat other people as devalued. And I think part of certainly the role of the third person there is to not allow that to occur, or try and prevent that if we can, or navigate through that very quickly, because I think people feeling a sense of disempowerment and devalued, and it's not going to get to a great resolution ever, I don't think, you know.
Kieran, I'm keen to know how you do deal with that. What would you say if Sam's rolling her eyes at my questions and thinking I'm asking too many questions and body language and making some funny facial expressions?
Well, I mean, if we were looking at a pure process there, I guess you'd probably call it timeout. And one of the questions I've found most useful going forward, not only for myself, but for others, and certainly avoiding judgment in any way, is this is what I'm seeing. I'm not sure what you're thinking, but if I'm seeing it, is this helpful? Is that helpful? And I think that's a much more powerful and non-confrontational way, a non-judgmental way to be curious to people about what they're doing, you know, or how they're coming across. Is that helpful? Do you think rolling your eyes or talking over the top of something, do you think that's helpful in this? Now, most people will come up potentially with a position on why they're doing it, because they know that very much they can't say, no, it's not helpful. But if we can get to a position where we are saying, no, you're right, it's not helpful, and we're starting to move forward, what's the one action we can do that's going to move us forward, you know? And that's, I think, for me as a conflict practitioner too, it's not around jumping to the end, it's around what's one little thing that maybe we can get some momentum on? What's one thing that we can find commonality on or agree on once we start to get in the habit of agreeing? It's a bit like an old defense barrister's technique in the witness box. I always say there's two really lonely places in the world, and I've been in both: the witness box and the boxing ring. Getting you to in the habit of saying yes to things, agreeing to things. And I think that's a very powerful tool in conflict as well. If we can find a lot of stuff on agreeing, then maybe we are starting to build a path forward.
I really like the way that you did it in a way that if it was me who was behaving badly and you were asking me those questions about whether it was helpful, you preserved my dignity too by not telling me off, telling me I was doing something unhelpful, by observing the behaviour non-judgmentally and then asking me to make a choice about whether or not I wanted to continue rather than being directive. So I like that you addressed it while preserving my own dignity and giving me a kind of a way to get out of the behaviour without feeling like I'd been told off like a naughty child.
Sam, I think fundamentally in any sort of conflict situation that we are involved, especially as a third person, whether it's a coach or a mediation or whatever it is, these are anxious times for people, right? They're difficult times, they're stressful times. Very few people embrace conflict as this is going to be great fun, right? So I believe we have an obligation or a duty to not make that worse, to not add to that person's anxiety or stress, especially not deliberately and hopefully not inadvertently. So how do we do that? Preserve people's dignity. You know, all those fundamental things I keep coming back to. How do we treat people? I do a lot of workplace investigations, and I don't know whether you'll agree with this or not, but I frame it up as a way, certainly an aspect of trying to resolve conflict. Okay, and again, workplace investigations can be very stressful for everyone involved. And I guess part of my mantra is how do I conduct it so the stress of the investigation doesn't add to people's personal stress around it?
I have a question about your investigations because I've not gone down that path. I'm mainly a mediator and trainer, etc., team culture stuff. I'm interested in when you do an investigation, is it your role to encourage use the word perpetrator, the offender, however, whatever term you use, how do you encourage them to take ownership of their behaviour? Is that part of your role? Because I know, I mean, it's hard enough in a mediation, let alone an investigation feels even more challenging and serious and probably in some ways maybe more difficult to help them take responsibility or accountability.
Well, to take accountability, you've got to have a level of insight, self-insight at some point. Some people struggle with that in my experience. My approach to investigations and why I probably get so many to do, unfortunately, is I probably try and focus on a bit more of the humanity. Now, definitely investigations are around on a balance of probability, which is a pretty low burden of proof for many things. Did this happen or not? It's a search for the truth. Okay. I don't make any recommendations about what's to happen as a result of the investigation. That's on to the respective HR teams or company or whatever they do. I try to have a relationship with the client where we can discuss those sort of things. However, sometimes accountability, I like to frame it as honesty and remorse can be your friends. And some people's lack of ability to take accountability in a workplace can have serious consequences. I've certainly been involved in some where a lack of accountability has resulted in termination and subsequent domestic issues that play out. So it's not up to me as an investigator, an impartial investigator, to cajole someone into taking accountability, but I do try and establish, the truth. Did this happen or not? Often I get an investigation and I look at it and I go, this could have all been prevented way back here, from a time perspective. That leads me to one of my favourite metaphors from Ernest Hemingway. How did you go bankrupt? Two ways, gradually, then suddenly. And so often, especially I think in conflict, we can look back or go, gee, this could have been resolved way back here when it was a little conflict instead now of a big conflict where potentially someone in the workplace may have consequences. Or if someone had intervened, and this is my earlier point around care and compassion in organisations, if somebody cared enough to address some behaviours when they were, or some language when it was little, we might not be. And so again, that caring enough about someone to say, if you keep going down that path, there potentially could be consequences. Some people don't take accountability, Scott, no matter what. And I certainly saw that in the police as a detective. No, wasn't me, didn't do it. Okay, well, your fingerprints are all over the place. But anyway, if that's your story, that's your story. We'll put it to the court. Let the jury decide. I just think it's what you do, whether it's a mediation, a workplace investigation, running workshops where you have difficult participants, Scott, someone that jumps up and says, this is all a crock, and wants to derail the whole thing. I say, okay, how are we going to navigate this? What's this about? One of the Irish was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I was running a workshop off-site one Saturday morning for leaders around dispute resolution in the workplace. And there was the sound of automatic gunfire coming from outside the compound. And we joked about, well, that's one way to resolve conflict, I guess. The sound of gunfire in the background was not an infrequent occurrence, unfortunately, in the Congo.
Wow. I know Sam's had I think you shared, Sam, where you were doing something with a group and one went up and gave the other one a good smack in the face, I think, wasn't it? Like that was around conflict resolution, wasn't it?
Yes.
Was that right?
It was meant to be a workshop, and it was a big paramilitary type organisation. There was about 40 people in the room. There'd been a lot of really bad behaviour going on in this group. And so my co-facilitator and I asked if anyone would like to talk about what was going on to get things started, and nobody said anything. Like nobody would say anything. And then eventually this guy stood up and said, I can't believe you're all sitting here and pretending nothing's happening. This is obviously a problem. And another guy stood up and said, mate, shut up, and then just punched him. We were like, oh, this is not a good start.
Yeah. Okay, that's a role play.
It was the catalyst that was needed to get people to actually take it seriously. But yeah, it wasn't the best start to a workshop.
No. I had a great experience just before Christmas in some ways. I had to do a mediation for two executives. There'd been an investigation. I didn't do the investigation. There'd been no outcome from it. But in my experience too, very few organisations do re-entry very well after an investigation. But this organisation said, look, it's been unsubstantiated, but these two have got to work together. They're happy for you to come and do a mediation. It's okay. Which is tricky, as you know, around workplace mediation. Sometimes people don't get the option, right? But anyway, these two executives, I met with them individually, as you do, and one said, I don't care what you say, I'm not apologising to that person. I said, well, it's not about apologising, right? We're not in grade 5. We don't shake hands, splash water on our face, and away we go. But just keep an open mind. And well, yeah, whatever. But I'm not apologising. I'm an absolute firm in there. Okay. So I went and spoke to the other person, and they were, less anchored. And we set the date for the mediation. But there was reluctance, but there was an acceptance that we need to go through this process. The day of the mediation, person B called in at the last minute sick. Person A flew into a rage. See, this is just blah, 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 I'm definitely not apologising. If you make me go, I'll go to the union, all sorts of things, whatever. Anyway, we rescheduled it and we started a couple of weeks later. And person B voluntarily spoke first, and very emotionally said, this is how you've made me feel over the last period of time. And person A, the first thing that came out of us was, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The person that was so anchored in not saying sorry said, I had no idea that's how I was making you feel. And to me, it was a great lesson in that difference between intention and impact as well for a lot of people. And again, understanding that humanity of that behaviour, this person feeling a certain way as a result of another person's actions, which they were generally like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. So that then led on to a good discussion, and I believe a more productive working relationship. So that's occasionally you've got to take the diamonds amongst the coal.
Kieran, any conflict pearls? You have shared a few today. Is there any one that you'd like to leave for the audience for our podcast today?
To me, the bigger one is, and they go hand in hand in my brain, humility and curiosity, and the power of asking questions. What are some really useful or helpful questions I can ask? How can I be curious and find out what's going on for this person. And I think the other thing that Sam, I know we've certainly spoke about this, is the gradually then suddenly, but how did we get to this point? There's a great book, Sam, I don't know whether you recommended it or not. It cost me a fortune when you recommend books, but a book around mental health, about what's happened to you, not what's wrong with you.
Yeah.
You know, such a great framing of how did we get to this point? And certainly as a police negotiator, one of my opening lines to create a connection, what's happened to bring you here today? What's happened to bring us to this point today? And just again, acknowledging everyone carries their invisible backpack. Everyone carries their stuff around, right? We've all got it. No one misses out. How do we be humble, to be curious, not judgmental, and try and understand what's going on for this person? How do we get to this point? The other thing I think is useful for me in interpersonal conflict is to almost depersonalize it to what's the problem we're trying to solve here. I try and teach my children and grandchildren, be hard on the problem and kind on the person. So let's really look at what's the issue, what's the problem. Let's put it on a whiteboard, or let's depersonalize it, especially in the workplace, right? You're never going to ask people to go to barbecues at each other's places, right? But how can we create a pathway for people not to feel like they have been, and that's helpful? How is this helpful?
Great advice, Kieran. Anything else, Scott, before we wrap up?
No, I think that's great. You've shared some great stories, great pearls. I think there's some really great little nuggets in there. Yeah, great work, Kieran. Appreciate your time.
No, I probably get a bit on a soapbox about this stuff. One of the things the Congolese say too is when we die, we should die empty, which means we should have imparted all our knowledge and all our gifts and all our experience and everything we can to try and make the place a little bit better. And I think that's a great philosophy.
I love it. Kieran, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure talking with you, and I'm sorry I cost you so much money in suggesting books to read.
That's all right. I love it. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for the invitation. It's been really great. Really appreciate the opportunity.
You're welcome. And everybody listening and watching, keep on working towards a more peaceful future.
And enjoy your conflict.